The train has already left the station. But if you act now, and I mean like right now, you might be able to jump on the back of the caboose of the Michael Pittman Jr. train, because I'm telling you right now, this soon-to-be third-year wide receiver is poised for a breakout in 2022, and I'm excited to dive into this young Colts wide receiver that I think has a chance to become a household top 12 dynasty wide receiver here in 2022. What's going on, y'all? It's your boy RayG. Y'all know me from Destination Debbie, and I am excited because this is my first piece of content as the newest team member of the Draft Network. Yes, I will be bringing you fantasy football, and in particular, dynasty fantasy football content here at the Draft Network, and we are going to focus on the details that matter the most, how these damn dudes play on the field. So I'm excited to bring you video content, and here in a couple of short weeks, myself along with the incredibly talented Keith Sanchez at The Talent Code on Twitter have a brand new podcast dropping on the network. So stay tuned for the Draft Good Players podcast brought to you by TDN. Speaking of good players, Michael Pittman Jr. Yes, he is somebody. We've seen his ADP this past offseason climb. And right now, according to Adecco, man, shout out to Adecco, does some of the best ADP work that you can find in Dynasty Fantasy Football. He is being drafted as wide receiver 14 in Dynasty Startups, right? That's a fourth round pick in Dynasty Startup drafts. Like I said, the train has already left the station, but if you act now, you still might be able to get some Michael Pittman Jr. because there's still some people out there that, I gotta see it, I gotta wait. Nah, man, draft him with confidence right now. And one of the big reasons why you should be excited about Michael Pittman Jr. is the upgrade at quarterback. Now, not often do we say a 37-year-old quarterback is an upgrade from a former MVP candidate in Carson Wentz, but that's exactly what Matt Ryan is. He is a massive upgrade over Carson Wentz, and some of the things that Matt Ryan does well bodes very well for Michael Pittman Jr. Most of MPJ's damage is done in the short and intermediate sections of the football field, and that matches perfectly with what Matt Ryan is doing at this stage of his career. Over the last 3 seasons combined, Matt Ryan, his completion percentage with passes in between 0 and 9 yards is 78.5%. When you expand that out to 10 to 19 yards, it's still a 65% completion percentage from Matt Ryan, which is spectacular because that's what Michael Pittman Jr. does well. And what's crazy about this is Matt Ryan was better than Carson Wentz in every quadrant of the field with a significantly worse offensive line. PFF graded the Atlanta Falcons offensive line as the 27th ranked offensive line unit after the 2021 season. And the Colts, for all intents and purposes, had a down year at offensive line, and they were still 12th in the NFL. So when you put Matt Ryan behind this offensive line, we should be excited for the outlook of Michael Pittman Jr. and hell, all the pass catchers for the Indianapolis Colts. When you think about Matt Ryan and the ex-receivers that he's had over his career, you think about Roddy White, Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley, Michael Pittman Jr. could be next up as one of the dominant ex-wide receivers paired with former NFL MVP Matt Ryan. Let's dive into how Michael Pittman Jr. works, and for that, we're going to use the help of Matt Harmon's beautiful reception perception, which gives us some very good data to be excited about. So, Michael Pittman Jr.'s success rate versus different coverages, right? Versus man coverage. 37% of Michael Pittman Jr.'s routes came against man coverage, and he had a 74.3% success rate, which is 79th percentile. Love it. Versus zone, this is where it gets juicy and good. 63% of his routes came against zone coverage with an 83.7% success rate, which is 88th percentile. And versus press, the big 6'4", can't beat press coverage, not quick enough. That was a lie. 16.5% of his routes came against press coverage, and he had an 82.2% success rate in those situations, which is 96th percentile. Some names that are in that category, when you go back and look through Harmon's database, he's up there with players like Justin Jefferson, Devontae Adams, Odell Beckham Jr., Michael Thomas. The list goes on and on and on. Now, this 6'4" monster is good versus all coverages, and he's continuing to succeed. When he was drafted in 2020, a lot of people thought he was just going to be a secondary wide receiver, a complementary piece. But the Colts have done little to nothing to add wide receiver competition for MPJ. They did bring in Alec Pierce, but I'm not worried about a rookie wide receiver out of Cincinnati. Michael Pittman Jr. is the guy. He's going to be the guy. He's going to operate as the guy, and I'm drafting him to be the guy for the Indianapolis Colts. We know MPJ has a quarterback upgrade. He's got one of the best offensive lines in football. He's got one of the best running backs in football. The film checks out. We know MPJ has a quarterback upgrade. They've got a dope offensive line and one of the best running backs in football. The dude is a beast. Matt Harmon told us we see it. The film checks out. But what do the numbers say? MPJ finished 2021 averaging 14 points per game, which was good for wide receiver 22 on the season. Not spectacular, not bad. Pretty damn good for a second-year wide receiver, but when we dive deeper into the numbers, and we're going to look at this prediction tree model built by my good friend Jordan Backus, director of Destination Devy Analytics, and I'm even more excited about MPJ going into year 3. So I'm looking at this. You can't see it, but it is a prediction tree model predicting wide receiver career points per game post-second NFL season. And this model was built using all wide receivers drafted from 2017, 2018, and 2019. Of that subset, the average career points per game for those wide receivers, 5.5. But when we start to dive a little deeper and filter out some of the junk, did the wide receiver average more than 7.7 points per game in his second season? If yes, go to the left. If no, go in the trash and go to the right. Michael Pittman Jr. did have more than 7.7 points per game in his second season, so we move down the prediction tree, and it gets us to 11 points per game. Did Michael Pittman Jr. in his second season average more than 11 fantasy points per game on that season? He absolutely did. We know he had 14 points per game. That puts him in a 23% category with players who fall into this bucket of career 13 points per game finish or higher. DK Metcalf, AJ Brown, Cooper Kupp, DJ Moore, Terry McLaurin, Chris Godwin, and Deebo Samuel. So when you're just looking at a floor for what Michael Pittman Jr. could be, looks like it's about 13 points per game, puts him in a tier 1 bucket. Listen, this is what I want to see. I want to know that did he hit those thresholds? Did those numbers check out? And based on the analytics that JB provided, he absolutely did. Now, it's not all pie in the sky, right? The Colts, I believe they were 27th in the NFL in pass attempts because they do have one of the best running backs in the NFL in Jonathan Taylor. So my only hesitation for the absolute rocket ship, which could be Michael Pittman Jr., is will the Colts throw the ball enough? But you know what? I'm willing to take a bet on a wide receiver that's already hit categories and is in the same company on film as a Michael Thomas, an Odell Beckham Jr., a Justin Jefferson, and a Devontae Adams. And then based on the analytical numbers, he's in the same category as a Chris Godwin, Deebo Samuel, Cooper Kupp, AJ Brown, Terry McLaurin. I want that guy. Coming off the board is wide receiver 14. There's still some players out there in your leagues that still don't know. They still want to see it. I'm telling you right now, I've seen it. I've crunched the numbers. Michael Pittman Jr. poised for a massive year 3 breakout. Get him in Dynasty. Is he going to turn into that alpha? We'll see, but I like where things are headed for Michael Pittman Jr. I appreciate y'all tapping into the show. Make sure you hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the content. Go to thedraftnetwork.com and check out all the dope content that the content creators there are putting out. And stay tuned for the new podcast with me and Keith Sanchez dropping in here in a couple of weeks. Thank you for tapping in. Excited for this journey with you all. I'm out of this thing. Peace.